In the middle of the 20th century, Iran stood at a pivotal moment in its modern history. A deeply traditional society was attempting to carve out a democratic path in a region dominated by monarchies, colonial legacies, and rising Cold War tensions. At the center of this struggle stood Mohammad Mossadegh, a well-educated nationalist who rose to power with the promise of economic sovereignty and political independence. Mossadegh's primary goal was straightforward but revolutionary. Iranian oil should benefit Iranians. That simple idea would place him in direct confrontation with two world powers, the United Kingdom and the United States, and ultimately lead to one of the most infamous covert operations in modern history, the 1953 Iranian coup d'etat, known as Operation Ajax. At the heart of the crisis was the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, or the AIOC, founded in 1908 following the discovery of oil in Iran by British geologist William Knox Darcy. AIOC quickly became a pillar of British colonial economic power. Though Iran technically owned the oil, the British government controlled AIOC and by extension Iran's oil revenues. For decades, AIOC extracted Iranian oil at immense profit. In 1950, Britain received the equivalent of $200 million in oil profits, while Iran received only a fraction, around $50 million, and even that was disputed. The Iranian people saw their natural wealth exported while they remained mired in poverty, with little infrastructure, education, or industry to show for it. As global anti-colonial sentiment grew in the post-World War II period, pressure mounted within Iran to take back control. The idea of nationalizing oil gained broad public support, especially among nationalists and reformists in the newly revived Iranian parliament, or Majlis. Mohammad Mossadegh was born in 1882 into a prominent family with ties to the Qajar royal court. He studied law in Paris and Switzerland and earned a doctorate in international law. His Western education did not diminish his patriotism, it sharpened it. By the late 1940s, Mossadegh had become a leading voice in the National Front, a political coalition advocating for democracy, secular governance, and an end to foreign control of Iran's economy. He was known for his integrity, transparency, and commitment to constitutionalism. In March 1951, the Majlis voted to nationalize the oil industry. Just 2 months later, Mossadegh was appointed prime minister by Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi. His first act in office was to enforce the nationalization law and take control of the Abadan refinery, the largest in the world at the time. Britain reacted with immediate hostility. London viewed the nationalization as theft and sought to isolate Iran economically. It imposed a global embargo on Iranian oil, withdrew British technicians, and mounted a legal and diplomatic campaign to undermine Mossadegh's government. The crisis escalated into what became known as the Abadan Crisis. The British government even considered military intervention. However, fearing wider conflict, especially after the Korean War, they abandoned this option. Instead, Britain turned to covert methods and sought the support of its key ally, the United States. Initially, the American government under President Harry S. Truman was hesitant to support British efforts. Truman and Secretary of State Dean Acheson believed Mossadegh was not a communist threat and respected his democratic mandate. However, this view changed drastically with the election of President Dwight D. Eisenhower in January 1953. By the early 1950s, the Cold War was intensifying. The Soviet Union shared a border with Iran, and the Tudeh Party, Iran's communist organization, had gained influence. British intelligence services capitalized on these fears, convincing the Eisenhower administration that Mossadegh was weak and that Iran was at risk of falling into Soviet hands. The CIA, under Director Allen Dulles, approved Operation Ajax, a joint CIA-MI6 plan to remove Mossadegh. The plan was led on the ground by Kermit Roosevelt Jr., a CIA officer and grandson of Theodore Roosevelt. The goal was to orchestrate a coup that would remove Mossadegh and strengthen the Shah's role as monarch, thereby ensuring Western access to oil and preventing Soviet influence. The operation unfolded in August 1953. It involved a combination of bribery, propaganda, political manipulation, and street violence. The CIA paid local newspapers to run anti-Mossadegh articles. It funded pro-Shah protests and fake communist riots to scare the middle class and clergy. Key military leaders were bribed to withdraw support for the prime minister. On August 15th, the Shah, acting under CIA pressure, signed a royal decree dismissing Mossadegh and appointing General Fazlollah Zahedi as the new prime minister. The attempt failed, and Mossadegh's forces arrested the coup plotters. The Shah fled Iran and took refuge in Rome. For 3 tense days, it appeared the coup had failed. But on August 19th, a second wave, better organized and more forceful, toppled the government. Armed mobs stormed Mossadegh's residence, and loyalist troops abandoned him. By the end of the day, the prime minister had been arrested. Mossadegh was tried for treason in a military court and sentenced to 3 years in solitary confinement, followed by house arrest until his death in 1967. He was never allowed to re-enter politics. The Shah returned to Tehran as a triumphant ruler. With US and British backing, he consolidated power, marginalized the parliament, and turned Iran into a pro-Western autocracy. He established the Savak, a brutal secret police force trained by the CIA and Mossad, which crushed dissent and political opposition. Economically, the oil industry was no longer under British monopoly, but control remained in foreign hands. A new international consortium was formed in 1954, in which American, British, Dutch, and French oil companies took control of Iranian oil production. Iran received a higher share of the profits, but sovereignty remained limited. The 1953 coup marked the first major covert operation by the CIA to overthrow a foreign government, a pattern that would repeat in Guatemala, Chile, and elsewhere. But in Iran, the consequences were particularly deep. The coup destroyed a fragile democratic movement and entrenched a monarchy that would later spark widespread resentment. Over the following 2 decades, political freedoms declined sharply. Though Iran modernized economically under the Shah, many Iranians saw this modernization as imposed and hollow. In 1979, a revolution erupted, toppling the Shah and bringing Ayatollah Khomeini to power. The revolution was not just religious. It was anti-imperialist, fueled by memories of 1953 and the betrayal of Mossadegh's vision. The new Islamic Republic quickly turned hostile toward the US and UK, culminating in the US embassy hostage crisis. Even today, many Iranians across political divides cite the 1953 coup as a pivotal moment in the nation's history. A moment when democracy was crushed not by internal failure, but by foreign greed. The story of Mohammad Mossadegh and the 1953 coup is a stark lesson in the dangers of foreign interference driven by resource control. His only real offense was demanding that Iran have the right to control its own oil and its own destiny. For that, his government was overthrown, and his country was subjected to decades of authoritarian rule. Britain wanted to preserve its economic interests. The United States feared the spread of communism. But in the process, both destroyed Iran's best chance at democracy in the 20th century. The legacy of that decision is still unfolding today. Every confrontation between Iran and the West carries the shadow of 1953, a moment when global powers chose profit over principle and control over cooperation.